On a Tuesday morning in October of 2003, a man named Leland Kowalski drove a 1991 Ford Ranger with a cracked windshield and two bald rear tires down a county road in Tama County, Iowa, and he had exactly $412 in his checking account, a cardboard box of clothes on the passenger seat, and nowhere else to go. He was 51 years old. Let me tell you about what he was driving toward, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened to the man who came back to it. The Kowalski farm sat on 160 acres of black Iowa soil on the west side of Tama County, 3 miles from the nearest grain elevator and 11 miles from the nearest town with a stoplight. His father, Casimir Kowalski, had bought the land in 1951 with money saved from 6 years of welding work in a Waterloo implement factory and a loan from a Polish Catholic credit union that no longer exists. Casimir had broken the ground himself with a borrowed tractor and a set of disc harrows that he repaired with baling wire and sheet metal when they broke. Because in 1951, you repaired things or you went without. He had built the farmhouse with his brother over 2 summers, framing it in green lumber that dried in place and never quite straightened out, which is why every door frame in that house sat at a slight angle that you only noticed when you tried to hang a picture level. He had farmed that ground for 40 years, raised 4 children on it, buried a son in the county cemetery who had lived 11 days, and he had never once in those 40 years planted a crop he did not intend to harvest himself. Leland was the youngest of the surviving children, and the only one who had stayed on the farm past high school. Or rather, he was the only one who had stayed until he didn't. Let me tell you about Leland Kowalski at 19, because you need to understand the boy to understand the man driving that truck. In 1971, Leland was lean and restless and possessed of the particular impatience that belongs to young men who are good with their hands but cannot yet see why that should matter. He had grown up watching his father fix things, watching his father read the sky and the soil and the behavior of machinery the way other men read newspapers. He had absorbed, without knowing he was absorbing it, 30 years of accumulated knowledge about how that specific piece of ground behaved in wet springs and dry Augusts, about which field drained first and which held water into June, about the particular grinding sound the PTO shaft made when the universal joint was beginning to wear, and you had about 40 hours left before it failed. He had learned all of this the way children learn language, which is to say without instruction and without awareness, simply by being present while it happened around him. And in 1971, he could not see that any of it was worth anything. What he could see was that his father made $11,000 in a good year. What he could see was that his 3 older siblings had left, and none of them had come back, and none of them seemed to be suffering for it. What he could see was that the boy 2 farms over had gone to Des Moines and was making more money in a month at an insurance company than Casimir made in a quarter. Leland had a girlfriend in Cedar Rapids who thought farming was something that happened to other people, and he had a restlessness in his chest that he mistook for ambition, and in the spring of 1972 he told his father he was leaving. Casimir Kowalski did not argue with him. He was not a man who argued. He was a man who did things and let the doing of them speak. He stood in the barn doorway with grease on his forearms and a socket wrench in his right hand, and he looked at his youngest son for a long moment, and then he said, "All right." And then he said, "Come back when you need to." And that was the whole conversation. Leland drove to Cedar Rapids. He married the girlfriend. He got a job in a printing company managing the floor operation, which turned out to suit him because it was essentially the same skill set as farming. You were managing machinery and schedules and the particular personalities of people who worked with their hands, but it paid better and it didn't require you to be outdoors in February. He was good at it. He got promoted. He bought a house in a subdivision where every yard was the same size and the grass was the same height, because the homeowners association sent letters if it wasn't. He had 2 sons. He coached Little League for 4 years. For a while, maybe 15 years, the life he had built felt like a life he had chosen, which is different from a life that happened to you, and the difference mattered to him. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story of the farm does not start with Leland arriving. It starts with Leland losing everything that had replaced it. The printing industry changed in the 1990s in ways that were not kind to men who had built careers inside it. The company Leland worked for was acquired in 1994 by a larger company that was itself acquired in 1997 by a holding group that had no particular interest in printing and every particular interest in the real estate the printing plant sat on. Leland was 51 years old and had been managing the same floor operation for 22 years when they handed him a severance package in a manila envelope and a handshake from a man in a suit who had never once been on the floor and did not know the names of any of the people who worked there. He had 6 months of salary. He had a resume that was essentially a single entry. He had a marriage that had been running on inertia for a decade and did not survive the loss of the income that had been its primary shared language. The divorce was not dramatic. That was almost the worst part. There was no single moment of rupture, no confrontation that clarified things. There was just a gradual mutual acknowledgement that they had been 2 people sharing a house and a schedule and not much else, and that the schedule was now gone, and that the house needed to be sold to divide the equity, and that the boys were grown and had their own lives in other cities and did not need their parents to stay together on their behalf. The whole thing was handled by lawyers and concluded in 11 months and cost Leland $22,000 he did not have, which is why he had $412 in his checking account when he drove that cracked windshield truck down the county road in Tama County in October of 2003. His mother had died in 1998. His father had died in 2001. He had come back for both funerals and left both times within 3 days because there was still a life in Cedar Rapids to return to, or at least the structure of one. His siblings had handled the estate. The farm had not been sold because none of them could agree on a price, and because Casimir had left a will that made sale complicated, requiring unanimous consent of all surviving children, and his oldest sister Pauline had refused to sign anything on the grounds that their father had not wanted it sold, and she intended to honor that. So the farm sat. Pauline paid the property taxes from her own pocket, which she could afford because she had married a dentist in Dubuque, and the taxes on 160 acres of Tama County farmland were not ruinous. She rented the cropland to a neighbor who farmed it with his own equipment and split the proceeds with the estate, which covered the taxes and left a small surplus that accumulated in an account nobody touched. The house sat empty. The barn sat empty. The outbuildings sat empty. And the things inside them sat where Casimir had left them, because nobody had come to move them. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked back into a place you grew up in after a long absence, not for a visit, but for keeps, not because you chose it, but because you ran out of other options? There is a specific quality to that experience that is different from nostalgia, and different from grief, and different from the ordinary discomfort of returning to a smaller version of a place you remember as large. It is something closer to being confronted with evidence. The place does not care that you left. The place does not care that you came back. The place simply exists in its current state and presents that state to you without comment, and what you do with the evidence is your own business. Leland Kowalski pulled into the driveway of the farm on a Tuesday in October and sat in the truck for 10 minutes before he got out. The farmhouse was standing, but it had not been painted since the late 1980s, and the white had gone to gray and was peeling in long curling strips on the south face where the sun hit it hardest. The front porch had lost 2 boards and the railing leaned outward at an angle that suggested it was considering falling over, but had not yet committed. The yard was a tangle of volunteer trees, box elders mostly, with some cottonwood saplings along the fence line, that had seeded themselves into the lawn over the years. Nobody had mowed it and were now 6 and 8 feet tall in places, their roots beginning to heave the concrete of the sidewalk. The garden his mother had kept was a rectangle of weeds. The clothesline poles were still standing, but the line had snapped and lay coiled in the grass. He got out of the truck and walked to the front door and used the key Pauline had mailed him and went inside. The house smelled of dust and old wood and something faintly sweet that he eventually identified as the dried remains of a wasp nest in the kitchen ceiling light fixture. The furniture was still there. His parents had not been people who replaced furniture, and the pieces in the living room were the same pieces that had been there when he left in 1972. The same couch with the same antimacassars on the arms, the same upholstered chair his father had sat in every evening to watch the news, the same oval braided rug on the floor that his mother had made from strips of worn-out clothing over the course of several winters. The rug had faded, but it was intact. The chair was dusty, but it was intact. The whole house was dusty, but intact, as if it had simply been waiting. He stood in the kitchen for a while. The linoleum was the same linoleum. The curtains were the same curtains, faded to a color that might have been yellow once. He opened the cabinet under the sink and found a box of steel wool pads, a bottle of dish soap that had thickened to gel, and a rusted can of Comet cleanser. He found a roll of paper towels on the counter that had gone brittle. He found, in the drawer next to the stove, a collection of rubber bands, a stubby pencil, 3 twist ties, a small screwdriver, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a parts list in his father's handwriting, written in the careful block letters Casimir used when he was writing something he intended to keep. Leland stood at the kitchen counter and read the parts list for a long time, though it was just a list of tractor parts: a PTO shaft seal, 2 hydraulic fittings, a set of valve cover gaskets, written in his father's hand on a piece of paper torn from a pocket notebook. He did not know why he stood there reading it as long as he did. He folded it back up and put it in his shirt pocket and went to see about the barn. Let me tell you about the barn, because the barn is where this story actually begins. Casimir Kowalski had built the barn in 1955, the year after a tornado had taken the previous one, and he had built it to last because he had no intention of building another one. It was a gambrel roof structure, 60 feet by 40 feet, with a concrete floor in the lower level and a hayloft above that could hold 300 bales and had held more in good years. The siding was vertical boards of rough-sawn white oak that had weathered to silver gray, and it was tight. Not a board missing, not a seam gapped enough to admit serious weather. The roof had lost some shingles on the north slope, and there was a water stain on the interior wall below the gap, but the structure was sound. Casimir had built things to last, and this barn had lasted. The lower level was where Casimir had kept his equipment, and the equipment was still there. Leland stood in the barn doorway and looked at it in the gray October light coming through the high windows, and what he saw was this: a 1957 Farmall 560 diesel tractor, red faded to rust orange, sitting on 4 tires that had gone flat and cracked but were still mounted on the rims. A set of disc harrows, 8 feet wide, leaned against the south wall. A 3-bottom plow with the moldboard still bright where the soil had polished them the last time it ran. A grain drill, a cultivator, a post hole digger, a workbench along the north wall with a vise bolted to one end, and above it, on a pegboard, a collection of hand tools arranged with a precision that had been undisturbed for 2 years since Casimir last touched them. Wrenches in descending size order, screwdrivers sorted by type, pliers and channel locks and a ball-peen hammer and a rubber mallet and a cold chisel and a set of punches, all hanging on their pegs exactly where they had been placed. And in the corner, under a canvas tarp that had gone stiff with age, something larger. Leland walked to the corner and pulled the tarp back and found his father's 1948 Oliver 88 Standard, the tractor Casimir had bought used in 1959 for $400 from a neighbor who was upgrading to a diesel and thought the old gasoline Oliver was past its useful life. Casimir had not thought so. He had rebuilt the carburetor and replaced the magneto points and put new rings in 2 cylinders and set the valve clearances and driven it for another 20 years as a utility tractor, using it for belt work and light field work and for any job where the Farmall was occupied elsewhere. The Oliver was painted a deep green that had not faded under the tarp, and it sat on 4 tires that were low but not flat, and when Leland put his hand on the hood it was cold but solid, and the sheet metal was straight, and the engine had a 1/4 inch of oil on the dipstick that was dark but not sludged. He stood there with his hand on the hood of his father's 1948 Oliver 88 for a while. He was not a sentimental man, or at least he had spent 30 years practicing not being one, but he stood there for a while. Let me tell you about the next 6 weeks, because they are the part of this story that most people would not have the patience for, and the patience is the whole point. Leland had no money to hire anyone. He had no money to buy new materials beyond the absolute minimum. What he had was time, and what he had, though he did not yet know he had it, was 30 years of dormant knowledge that was about to wake up. He started with the house because he needed to sleep somewhere warm, and he worked from the inside out, which is what you do when you're trying to get a building livable before winter, and you cannot afford to do everything at once. He fixed the furnace first, which turned out to need a new thermocouple and a cleaned burner assembly, both of which he diagnosed by listening to how it cycled, and both of which he fixed with parts from a supply house in Marshalltown that cost him $63. He knew how to diagnose a furnace because his father had diagnosed furnaces the same way, by listening, and he had watched his father do it enough times that the knowledge was simply there when he reached for it. This kept happening. He patched the porch boards with lumber he salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding at the back of the property, pulling nails and cutting the boards to length with a handsaw he found on the barn workbench, sharp because Casimir had kept his tools sharp. He restrung the clothesline. He fixed the kitchen faucet, which had a worn washer, using a washer he found in a coffee can of miscellaneous hardware on the workbench. He rehung 3 interior doors that had dropped on their hinges by tightening the hinge screws, and where the screws had stripped the wood, he filled the holes with wooden matchsticks and wood glue, which is what you do when you grew up watching someone do it that way, because it works and it costs nothing. He found a roll of weather stripping in the basement and resealed the back door, which had been losing heat through a gap you could see light through. None of these were complicated repairs, but each one required him to know what was wrong before he could fix it, and the knowing kept coming from somewhere he hadn't accessed in 30 years, arriving not as memory exactly, but as instinct, as the particular kind of attention his hands paid to things when he let them. He would pick up a tool and know how to hold it. He would listen to a machine and know what it was telling him. He would look at a piece of failed material and know why it had failed and what would fix it. His father was in his hands. That is the only way to say it accurately. By mid-November, the house was livable. Not comfortable by the standards of the subdivision in Cedar Rapids, but livable in the way the house had always been livable, which is to say warm and dry and functional, a place where the systems worked and the spaces served their purposes without decoration. He had spent $240 on materials. He had 400 square feet of roof on the barn's north slope still to address before serious winter, and he had the matter of the Farmel 560 and the Oliver 88 sitting on flat and cracked tires in the barn, and he had the 160 acres of ground outside that the neighbor had been farming on a handshake arrangement with the estate, and that was now, technically, his responsibility to think about. He called Pauline in Dubuque. He told her he was there and that he intended to stay, and that he wanted to buy out the other siblings' shares if they were willing to sell. Pauline was quiet for a moment, and then she said she'd been waiting for someone to come back to it, and she was glad it was him. His brother Gerald, who lived in Phoenix and had not been to Iowa in 9 years, sold his share for what Leland calculated was slightly below market value, apparently just to be done with the administrative burden of owning a piece of land he never intended to see again. His sister Rosemary, in Milwaukee, took 6 weeks to decide and then sold at the same price as Gerald. Pauline refused to sell her share, but said she would sign over decision-making authority to Leland in writing, and that he should just farm the thing and let her know how it went. He borrowed money from a credit union in Marshalltown to buy out Gerald and Rosemary. The loan officer was a man named Dennis Sievert, who had been making agricultural loans in Tama County for 22 years, and who looked at Leland's application. A 51-year-old man with no income, no recent agricultural experience, a recent divorce, and a truck with bald tires, with an expression that was professionally neutral but communicated a specific skepticism that Leland recognized and did not argue with. He told Dennis Sievert that he had 160 acres of ground that was currently generating rental income, that he intended to farm it himself starting in the spring, and that the loan was for equity purchase, not operating capital. Dennis Sievert approved the loan at an interest rate that reflected his skepticism. Leland signed the papers. Now, let me pause here and tell you about the thing that happened in December, because it is the thing that changed the direction of what followed. The neighbor, who had been renting the cropland, was a man named Arlen Thornton, 58 years old, who farmed 800 acres across 3 Tama County townships, with 2 late-model John Deere row-crop tractors and a hired man who worked April through October. Arlen was not a bad man. He was a practical man, which in farming means a man who makes decisions based on what works at scale and what the current commodity markets support. And in 2003 in Tama County, what worked at scale was corn and soybeans in rotation, planted with GPS-guided equipment and managed with a fertilizer and herbicide program that Arlen's agronomist designed each year based on soil tests. Arlen was good at this. He had expanded from 200 acres to 800 in 15 years, and he had done it without going broke, which is not as common as it sounds. Arlen came to see Leland in December, driving a new 3/4-ton Chevy pickup that was clean, in the way that farm trucks are only clean when the owner has a hired man to wash them. And he sat at Casimir's kitchen table and drank Leland's coffee and explained that he had been farming the ground for 3 years under the arrangement with the estate, and that he would like to continue doing so, and that he was prepared to offer a cash rent of $140 per acre per year for the cropland, which was approximately market rate for Tama County ground in 2003. Leland thanked him and said he was going to farm it himself. Arlen Thornton looked at him with the particular expression that practical men use when they encounter a decision they consider impractical. He said that was fine, of course, and that Leland was welcome to it, but that he might want to think about what equipment he had and what equipment he would need and what that equipment would cost, and that the math on 160 acres of row crops was not always as favorable as people imagined, and that the rental income was guaranteed money, and farming it himself was not guaranteed money. He said this in the tone of a man who is being helpful, and not the tone of a man who is being dismissive, but the content of what he said was dismissive, and both of them knew it. He finished his coffee and drove away in the clean truck. Leland sat at the kitchen table for a while after Arlen left. He had the parts list in his father's handwriting in his shirt pocket, which he had taken to carrying there without quite deciding to. He took it out and looked at it. PTO shaft seal, 2 hydraulic fittings, valve cover gaskets. He went out to the barn. Let me tell you about what Leland Kowalski did between December of 2003 and April of 2004, because it is the part of this story that nobody saw and nobody gave him credit for, which means it is the part that mattered most. He started with the Oliver 88 because it was simpler and because he needed a working tractor before he needed a big one. He pulled the carburetor and soaked it in a coffee can of carburetor cleaner he found on the shelf above the workbench, still sealed, and rebuilt it with a kit he ordered from an antique tractor part supplier in Missouri for $14. He replaced the magneto points and condenser. He drained the oil, which came out the color of used coffee, and refilled it with fresh 30 weight. He pulled the head and found the 2 cylinders his father had re-ringed in the 1970s were still serviceable, but the other 4 had worn enough that compression was uneven, so he ordered a complete ring set and re-ringed the engine himself on the workbench using a ring compressor he found hanging on the pegboard. He lapped the valves. He set the clearances with the feeler gauge from his father's toolbox, the old Starrett gauge with the blades worn thin from years of use, the feel of it in his fingers immediately correct in a way he could not have explained. He worked in the barn in the cold, wearing his father's insulated coveralls that he found hanging on a nail inside the barn door, and they fit him well enough because he and Casimir had been the same height and Leland had lost weight in the past year. He worked with a drop light hung from a rafter nail and a portable propane heater that kept the temperature around 40 degrees, which was cold enough that the oil was thick and the metal was unforgiving but warm enough that his hands worked. He worked mostly in silence. The barn held sound differently than the house, absorbed it rather than reflecting it, and in the silence he could hear the specific sounds of the work, the click of the ratchet, the particular resistance of a bolt that had been in place for 50 years, the sound of a gasket surface being cleaned with a scraper, all of it familiar in a way that had no explanation except that he had heard these sounds before, in this barn, watching his father's hands. The Oliver 88 started on the 3rd attempt in late January. It ran rough for 20 minutes while the new rings seated, and then it smoothed out. And when it smoothed out, the sound it made was the sound Leland remembered from childhood. the particular four-cylinder rhythm of that engine at idle, and he sat on the tractor's seat in the cold barn and let it run. He did not tell anyone about this. There was no one to tell. The Farmel 560 took longer because it was larger and because the hydraulic system had developed a leak in the pump that required him to pull the pump and replace the seals, which required a seal kit he had to source from a Farmel parts dealer in Illinois, and which required him to learn the specific procedure for the 560 hydraulic pump from a service manual he found in a cardboard box under the workbench, a yellowed IH service manual that Casimir had kept because Casimir kept everything that might be useful. The manual was complete. Leland read it in the evenings at the kitchen table under the overhead light, reading it the way he had once read production schedules at the printing plant, looking for the logic of the system, understanding the sequence before he touched anything. He pulled the pump in February and rebuilt it and reinstalled it, and it held pressure. By the first week of March, he had 2 working tractors, a functional disc harrow, a 3-bottom plow, and a grain drill. He had spent $480 on parts. He had the implements his father had used to farm this ground for 40 years, maintained by the same hands that had originally maintained them, or near enough. Let me tell you about what Arlen Thornton said when he drove past in late March and saw the Oliver 88 pulling the disc harrow across the field that bordered the county road, because it is instructive. Arlen stopped his truck on the road and watched for a while, and then he drove to the end of the field and waited for Leland to come around. When Leland came around, Arlen was leaning on the hood of the truck with his arms crossed, and he watched Leland make the turn at the end of the field with the Oliver, a careful, unhurried turn, the kind of turn you make when you have learned to turn with that particular implement. And then Arlen said, "That's a 1948 Oliver." Not a question, a statement of something he was trying to reconcile with what he was seeing. Leland said yes. Arlen said, "Your father's?" Leland said yes. Arlen looked at the tractor for a moment, and then he looked at the field, which was disked clean and level, the soil turned and broken the way it needed to be. He said, "Huh," and then he drove away. That was the whole conversation. But the arms had uncrossed before he left, and Leland noticed. Now, let me tell you about the spring planting, because this is where the knowledge that Leland had carried without knowing he was carrying it began to show itself in ways that had nothing to do with mechanics. He planted corn on the ground that had been in soybeans the previous year, which was correct rotation, and he planted soybeans on the ground that had been in corn, which was also correct rotation, and he did this without consulting anyone because he knew it. The same way he knew that the low corner of the east field held water in wet springs and should be planted last and should get a hybrid with better tolerance for wet feet, and he knew that the ridge ground on the north end was where the soil was thinnest and where you could lose yield fast in a dry July if you pushed the population too hard. He knew these things about this specific piece of ground because he had watched his father manage this specific piece of ground for the first 19 years of his life, and the knowledge of it was not in his memory exactly. It was in a place deeper than memory, in the part of him that knew things without being able to say when he had learned them. He planted with the grain drill at a pace that Arlen Thornton's GPS-guided equipment would have found comically slow. He did not have GPS guidance. He had the line of the previous pass and his own eye and the particular skill of keeping a tractor straight across a field that takes years to develop, and that he apparently still had or had recovered because the rows came out straight. The spring was wet, which was not unusual for Tama County, and the low corner of the east field was wet longer than the rest, which was exactly what he had expected, and the hybrid he had planted there handled it and came up even. The ridge ground on the north end came up thin in one area where he had pushed the population slightly, and he noted it and filed it away for next year. He worked from before daylight to after dark in April and May, which is what planting season requires, and he worked alone, which is harder but not impossible, and he went to bed each night in his father's house in a state of physical exhaustion that was different from any tiredness he had experienced in 30 years of managing a printing floor, different because it was whole body and because it came from work that was directly connected to a result he could see, and he slept in a way he had not slept in years. Let me tell you about the summer, because the summer is when the farm started to look like a farm again. The corn came up even and dark green, and grew through June and July with the particular authority that corn grows in black Iowa soil in a year with good rains. Leland cultivated it once in early June with his father's cultivator, running between the rows to knock down early weeds, which is a practice that had largely been replaced by herbicide programs on farms like Arlen Thornton's, but which worked fine and cost nothing beyond fuel. He walked the fields in the evenings after the day's work, the way his father had walked them, not for any specific purpose but to look, to read what the plants were telling him. He found a patch of gray leaf spot in the south field in mid-July and scouted it and decided it was not severe enough to warrant a fungicide application, which turned out to be the correct decision. He found a section of the east field where the corn was yellowing slightly and diagnosed it as a sulfur deficiency from the soil test he had run in April, and he side-dressed that section with a sulfur application that cost him $60 and corrected the problem. He was doing, without being able to fully articulate it, what his father had done for 40 years. He was reading the farm. He was having a continuous conversation with 160 acres of ground that required attention and response, and the particular kind of knowledge that is not general agricultural knowledge but knowledge of a specific place, its specific tendencies and weaknesses and strengths, accumulated over time by someone who had paid attention. He had paid attention for 19 years without knowing he was doing it, and now, at 51 on the other side of 30 years of a different life, the attention was still there. Let me tell you about the day in September when Arlen Thornton came back, because it is the day the story turns. Arlen drove in on a Saturday morning in mid-September, and Leland was in the barn doing maintenance on the farmel, changing the oil and checking the hydraulic fluid level. Arlen stood in the barn doorway and looked at the farmel and then looked at the corn in the field beyond the barn, which was standing straight and dark and full, the ears set heavy and the husks tight. He stood there for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "That's a good stand." Leland said it had been a decent year. Arlen said, "No, that's a good stand. What hybrid did you put in?" Leland told him. It was a pioneer hybrid his father had used in the late 1990s, a proven variety that was not the newest genetics but was well suited to Tama County soil and had a strong yield history in that specific area. Arlen knew the hybrid. He nodded slowly. Arlen said, "You cultivated that south field." Leland said he had. Arlen said, "I can tell. You've got less rootworm pressure than I've got in my ground across the road. I've been seeing some lodging over there." He paused. "I haven't cultivated in 12 years." They stood in the barn doorway for a moment. Then Arlen said, "Your father used to cultivate every year." Leland said yes. Arlen said, "I thought that was just because he didn't have the chemical program." He said it in the tone of a man who is revising a conclusion he had held for a long time. Leland did not say anything to that. He went back to checking the hydraulic fluid, but after Arlen left, he stood at the workbench for a while with his hand on the parts list in his shirt pocket. The harvest that fall was not a record. It was not the kind of harvest that gets written up in the Farm Bureau newsletter. It was 160 acres of corn and soybeans that came in at yields consistent with the county average, which was what Leland had aimed for in his first year back, having enough sense to know that the first year was for learning the ground again and not for setting records. He ran the grain cart himself and hauled to the elevator in Tama with the farmall pulling a borrowed wagon, making more trips than Arlen Thornton's operation would have made because his equipment was smaller and older, but making them steadily and without breakdown because the equipment was maintained and he knew how to run it. He cleared, after the loan payment to Dennis Evert's credit union and the input costs and the fuel and the parts, $14,000. It was not a lot of money, but it was money from ground that he owned, from work that he had done with his own hands and his father's tools, and it was more than he had made in the previous 2 years combined, and he had made it on equipment that had cost him $480 to restore to working condition. Let me tell you about the winter that followed, because the winter is when the farm became something more than a farm. He spent the winter the way his father had spent winters, which is to say, maintaining things and improving things and preparing for the following year. He replaced the roof shingles on the barn's north slope, working on clear days and stopping when the temperature dropped below 20. He rebuilt the fence line on the east side of the property, pulling old posts and setting new ones, stretching new wire. He overhauled the grain drill, replacing the seed tubes and the press wheels, adjusting the depth settings. He painted the house, starting with the south face, using a paint sprayer he borrowed from a neighbor and a ladder he found in the machine shed, working on the days when the temperature was above 40 and the wind was calm. He did not think of these things as rehabilitation or restoration. He thought of them as maintenance, which is what they were. You maintained things so they were ready when you needed them. You did not wait for things to fail and then address the failure. You addressed the tendency toward failure before it became failure. This was not a philosophy he had formulated. It was a practice he had absorbed. His son, Marcus, came to visit in January. Marcus was 26 and lived in Minneapolis and worked in software and had not been to Iowa since Casimir's funeral. He drove down on a Friday and stayed through Sunday and spent most of Saturday walking around the farm with Leland, looking at the barn and the equipment and the fields and the house. He was quiet most of the time, which Leland interpreted as the polite reserve of a young man who did not know what to say about a place he had no connection to. But on Sunday morning over coffee, Marcus said, "I didn't know you knew how to do any of this." Leland thought about that for a moment. He said, "I didn't know either." Marcus said, "Where did you learn it?" Leland looked at the window, at the gray January fields outside, at the barn his father had built in 1955. He said, "I grew up here." Marcus was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I don't think I understood what that meant." Leland said, "Neither did I, for a long time." Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end with the first harvest, and it does not end with Marcus's visit. And the thing that happened over the next decade is the thing that makes this story worth telling. Leland farmed the ground for the next 11 years. He did not expand. He did not buy additional acreage. He did not upgrade to GPS-guided equipment or switch to a no-till system or adopt any of the practices that the Extension Service and the seed dealers and the agronomists promoted in those years, not because he was opposed to them, but because he was farming 160 acres with equipment that worked and a knowledge of that specific ground that was worth more to him than any technology he could buy, and the combination was sufficient. He made money in most years and broke even in the bad ones, and he never had a year where he lost money, which in Tama County farming over an 11-year period is a record that a significant number of operators with much larger and more modern operations cannot match. He cultivated every year. He walked his fields every week during the growing season. He kept a notebook, a pocket notebook, the same brand his father had used because that was what the hardware store in Tama carried, in which he recorded observations about the fields, which areas had been wet or dry, where he had seen pest pressure, what the yields had been by field section, what the soil test showed. He did not do this because anyone told him to. He did it because his father had done it, and he had found his father's notebooks in a box in the basement, 22 years of pocket notebooks in rubber bands, and he had read them in the evenings that first winter and understood that what he was reading was a 40-year conversation between a man and a piece of ground, conducted in the plain language of observation and response. He started his own conversation, and he kept it going. Arlen Thornton came to see him in the spring of the second year and asked if he would be willing to talk about his cultivation program, specifically about the rootworm pressure he was seeing in his own fields. Leland talked to him. He did not say anything dramatic about old methods versus new ones, or about what his father had known that modern agronomy had forgotten. He just described what he did and why he did it, in the plain language of a man who has observed something over time and drawn conclusions from the observation. Arlen listened. He started cultivating again the following year, not all his acres, but some of them, the ones where he had been seeing the worst pressure. Let me tell you about the morning Leland found the second box of notebooks, because it is the moment the story becomes something other than a farming story. He was cleaning out the attic in the second winter, sorting through the accumulated material of his parents' lives, and he found a box he had not seen before, pushed to the back under the eaves, a cardboard box sealed with tape that had dried and released, the flaps just resting closed. He opened it and found inside it a collection of objects that his father had apparently kept without ever discussing. A photograph of Casimir as a young man, maybe 25, standing in front of a piece of machinery in what appeared to be a factory, wearing work clothes and squinting into the sun. A letter in Polish that Leland could not read from someone he did not recognize, dated 1949. A small, leather-bound notebook, different from the pocket notebooks, older, with a broken clasp, that turned out to be a journal of some kind, also in Polish. A photograph of a farm that was not this farm, a smaller place, with a house that looked European and a child standing in the yard who might have been Casimir at 8 or 9 years old. He sat on the attic floor with the box open in front of him and understood that he was looking at the life his father had come from, the life before Iowa, before the credit union loan and the gambrel roof barn and the 40 years of pocket notebooks. He understood that his father had arrived in Iowa with nothing except the knowledge of how to work and how to pay attention and how to make things last, and that he had built everything Leland had come back to from that starting point, and that the knowledge of how to do it had not come from Iowa. It had come from wherever that photograph was taken, from whoever had taught Casimir to work the way he worked, from a chain of transmission that went back further than Leland could trace. He had inherited a farm. He had also inherited a way of being in the world, and he had carried it for 30 years in a city without knowing it was there, and now he was using it, and it worked. He took the photograph of the young Casimir downstairs and put it on the kitchen windowsill where the light hit it in the morning. let me tell you about the last thing, because it is a thing the story has been moving toward since Leland pulled into the driveway in October of 2003 and sat